self-aware. And it's not the absence of those bumps, like you said, Matt, but it's more of being able to recognize, okay, what do I do when I have a bump come my way? What do I do when I get off track with my reading and prayer life? Am I able to quickly bring that back into where it needs to be?
Welcome back, listeners, to Breaking Bread, and welcome back to Amber Miller and Kirk Plattner to the studio today.
Hey,
welcome.
Matt.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Great to have you both here. Kirk is an outreach manager for Harvest Call. He and his wife, having spent 4.5 years on the mission field in Jamaica, and now employed by Harvest Call. And today I want to talk a little bit about preparing for mission. Okay. No doubt we have many on the other side of this mic who's praying about, thinking about missionary, thinking about engaging in Harvest Call. We've got moms and dads that are working with their kids, or grandmas and grandpas with grandchildren making this decision, or themselves making this decision, right? And so the question at hand, I think, we'd like to talk about today is, how do we prepare? What does it look like to become prepared for mission?
Preparation is absolutely critical, and whether it's spiritually, physically, mentally, whatever it is, we must be prepared. But one aspect we must start off with is the fact that the grace of God to prepare us in ways that we never would even have thought about, using past life experiences in actually preparing us. So again, we can talk about different resources. We can talk about actual methods of preparation. None of them compare to what God does in bringing somebody through certain experiences in life that help prepare them for what He has for them next.
Yep.
And I think you have to start at that place.
I think this discussion is a tricky one to have, too, because you get two sides of the spectrum here, right? Where there's some of us who may be more logical or lean more heavily on the counting the cost aspect of preparing yourself for mission, and then others who may gravitate toward the blind faith almost and jumping in very quickly. And so I think even as we have this discussion, it's being able to call out those two extremes and recognize that it's not either or,
right,
and that is more spiritual. It's a balance of those two.
Kind of a both and. Certainly, faith is required. A faith that logic doesn't connect the dots on why I should be doing this, right? But certainly to be going in with my eyes open and thinking about what I'm going to encounter and what I might need to do to prepare myself. Now, I think, Kirk, if I understand it right, in the role that you play at Harvest Call, in the role that Harvest Call plays in this outreach effort, preparation is a key part.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, before we even get there, I'd go back to what Amber just said and say one of the first steps may be self-assessing. Where would you be at on that spectrum?
Okay.
And if you would find yourself in a position that is a blind faith position, you may need to push yourself to go ahead and ask for resources and dive into some of those things you need to be doing to prepare. And if you're on the other side of that, to where you're wanting to read every word and take all these classes and everything, you may need to understand the fact that as much as you prepare, you're not going to be prepared. We prepare in wisdom, right? And asking the Lord to bless that. But in any sense, I've had that pushback before, saying, well, what do you think, having all these missionaries go through this training or that training, you think they're really going to be prepared for the mission field? Well, no, they're not. I mean, we never are prepared. Are you prepared for marriage after going through marriage counseling?
Right.
Are you prepared for
kids?
Parenting after you've gone through a parenting class? I mean,
I never did get my manual for kids.
We can talk about that later. But the reality is that it's a big deal, and we don't know what's coming. And so there is a spiritual faith perspective to it that says, well, if you've been called, we're going to entrust that to the Lord.
Well, let's go into that kind of self-assessment that you mentioned. And I don't know if this is what you meant, but this is what I heard, that there is a bit of probably some spiritual self-reflection to say, am I spiritually at a good place to answer such a call? Am I right on that?
Absolutely.
And if the answer to that is yes, then what would be some of those earmarkers or metrics?
No brother or sister enters the outreach process, is what we call our missionary process of selection, without the first step is that conversation with your elder to say, am I ready for this? And from a spiritual perspective.
And that will probably be part of his questions, would be of the spiritual nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll support that as well, but we really do see that as an initial gate and accountability from the get-go that says, am I spiritually ready for this? And receiving counsel on that issue.
Let's even paint with a smaller brush. Amber, what would be some of the elements then spiritually that I should be thinking about perhaps?
One of those to me would be living and overcoming life. I think there can be this assumption of, hey, it will be different because this is a calling. And if you're not living out life that is overcoming from sinful tendencies, or you're not actively working on sanctification, it's going to be hard to do that as well on the mission field, and to frame that in a healthy way.
Well, let me jump in and say, I think I'm tracking with what you're saying, Amber, but even just mentioning overcoming is quite an admission. What we're saying is that there's something to overcome. So we're not talking about a person who has no bumps in their road. Right. No, they've got bumps, and maybe significant bumps that they have to overcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of focus. You're going to hear this a lot today of just being self-aware. And it's not the absence of those bumps, like you said, Matt, but it's more of being able to recognize, okay, what do I do when I have a bump come my way? What do I do when I get off track with my reading and prayer life? Am I able to quickly bring that back into where it needs to be? Or, does that take me 3 months before I get back into a regular schedule? So just thinking about that, how do you respond to setbacks, I think is another element of where you're at spiritually.
So not that setbacks are not present, but a person with a self-awareness to say, oh, I'm in a setback, and this is how I react to that, whether it be a struggle of faith, a struggle of prayer, a struggle of reading the scriptures, of devotion, or whatnot. What would you add to that, Kirk?
Looking at where you currently are in your current calling in life, right? Again, we're not talking about this calling that's super special and unique. You have had a place where the Lord has had you previously, and where He's been asking you to engage in whatever that is. And I think examining that and looking at that and saying, how have I engaged? How am I engaged with the body of Christ locally, on a local level?
And let me just capture this thought. As you say that, what you've just said there is that everybody should realize that their past has not been a mistake. God has been preparing me, like David with his sheep was being prepared. That was not a time of mistake in David's life, but very intentional. And I think of a brother in my local church who retired at 68 or whatever and became involved in another ministry in town. And he told me, he said, Matt, the Lord has been preparing me for 40 years for this very job. So he has seen now the climax of his life to be now in his late 60s in his particular ministry that he's serving at. And he has seen all of his career as preparatory. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I was so encouraged by that. But again, it takes that presupposition to say, I am now currently being prepared for something, or I have been currently prepared. And you're saying, can you spot it?
Absolutely. And if you've not been stepping into it, that may be a piece of self-awareness. It says, well, I might need to, at my current place in time, step further into what the Lord's already had for me before I step onto the mission field.
Right.
And that's part of what our responsibility is to work through that with brothers and sisters. And so we do. And when they start engaging with Harvest Call, we start asking some of those questions. And when they start engaging with Harvest Call, we send them over to ACCFS and encourage them to have some of those same conversations. And we give them some tools to help bring some of that self-awareness and have some of those conversations.
So a lot of your conversations then would be self-awareness. Amber, is that a kind of a good way to say it? As you work with a person pre-going on the field?
Yeah, definitely. Being able to dig a little deeper and maybe look at some things maybe in different lenses. Another aspect that certainly comes to mind is just, what is your view of self and what is your view of God? Again, we're not looking for people that don't have scars and bumps and bruises and that they've had along the way, but rather that you have people that are in a good spot with those things too.
Yeah.
And recognizing just your view of the Lord. It's hard. I'll just put it this way. It's really hard when you go down and you constantly see things that don't make sense in a place like Haiti, when you constantly see poverty or all of these things on a new and deep level. And so if you already have some distortions in your head about how God is a provider,
some of those core things about God and His goodness can be shaken in those moments.
Yes, exactly.
So on the contrary to this picture of somebody coming whose life looks like it's all perfect, it can almost be a red flag. Right? Because of the realities that we know from having been on the field and talked with those who are serving. It is about that resiliency. It is about how do I respond to this challenge that's ahead of me? And in a spiritual sense, how do I overcome in those moments?
This concept of overcoming is huge. Look at the battle that Satan wins when we don't overcome. And I hope I'm wrong with this, but I do believe that he keeps a lot of us immobilized. He keeps a lot of us just afraid to move for God simply because of something in our life that we're not overcoming in. Does that make sense? And wonderfully, the gospel lets us loose to overcome those things. And then these fields that are white into the harvest that God is calling us in can be engaged in when we do that. I think it's a powerful call to all of us, wherever we're at.
Yeah, and so certainly like how you respond to fear, how you respond to anxiety or difficult things that come your way, traumas in your past. Are you living life from a victim mentality? Because if you are, there will certainly be opportunity on the mission field to feed into that and to grow that and to create more isolation or just more difficulty in connecting with people back in the States later on. So all of those things is just a handful, but those would all be elements that we want to look at and evaluate and talk through.
So it's what I'm hearing you is almost, again, going to the self-awareness piece of saying, now that I know this about myself, how are they going to play in this new environment? This may be drag on me. Now, this may be pro for me, but some of these things may be drag. And kind of owning that.
I would just add that this self-awareness piece, it's not some mystical piece, right? This is a spiritual function of saying, Lord, search me.
Yeah.
Lord, I want to know you and I want you to know me. It's a very relational piece. It flows out of our relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
I think another spirit that we look for in people is the ability to be a learner, someone that doesn't think they have all the answers or they have life figured out, but rather that they're self-aware enough to say, man, this is a struggle of mine. This is a weakness. And because that is, here's what I have in place to help sanctify myself in that area. And so I think, again, just a learner attitude instead of someone that's very rigid in their thinking is important.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that's even compounded then when we go to a different culture, right? Where all of a sudden A and B don't make C like they do in the States. Am I right?
The temperature's just turned up. Yeah. Right? Often in our places where we minister, literally, it's the temperature's turned up, which can bring out unique perspectives and unique issues. But in all areas, the temperature's just turned up. And so when we're thinking about relationally, if we're thinking about a marriage, right, and what that marriage is going on the field and its problem areas, that temperature in those problem areas is only going to get turned up.
Yeah.
In the places where it's strong, the idea is to be working on those things, right? And by the grace of God, coming out stronger than what you went in. But the realities are, if it's somebody who's going to ignore some of the struggle areas, then the temperature is only going to get turned up in those areas.
Yeah, and they will manifest themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we've all experienced this too in all of our callings. This Satan is oppressive. He is an adversary. No doubt he wants to see mission fail. He wants to see God compromised. He wants to see his name muddied. And I would imagine he turns on the heat because of that too.
Absolutely.
And not only for the missionary themselves, but also for their family. I think that may be another just unspoken expectation is that things will go well for my kids, or they'll really embrace this experience, or they'll be able to pick up the language really quick and adapt. And the reality is that if you have one family member struggling, it's going to affect the whole system. It's going to affect the whole family. And so not to bring shame on someone that is struggling, but just to recognize that that too is a dynamic. And so even if you personally are the one that is feeling that call to be sent, consider where your whole family is at, because you're not just going yourself, you're going as a whole family.
Mm-hmm. Kirk, we've been talking about preparing for mission, and I know something that just came across my inbox from Harvest Call, an initiative called Learn and Discern. I think this would be a great opportunity for you to share with the listeners about what that means.
Yeah, we would love to engage with our brothers and sisters as early in the process as they want in regards to if they're starting to feel a prompting or a calling, or just even wondering about whether the Lord has them on a path towards service. And so with that, we want to form these Learn and Discern groups, which will be groups that will gather together online, couples and singles. We will gather on a web conference maybe every other week and talk through these potential callings and pray through them together, and potentially and along the way learning different aspects about discerning the Lord's will and what some of these callings could mean.
I think that's incredibly exciting. If anyone would like to learn more, where might they go?
Yeah, they could go to the website, and there's information there. They could learn more about it. They could contact me directly at kplattner@harvestcall.org, and we would love to just, even if you don't even know this is for you, just reach out to us, and we will walk alongside you.
And with that, let's draw today's episode to a close. Thanks, Kirk and Amber, for your important contributions in preparing for missions. And we can think about that in the future tense. How should I prepare for missions? But we've been encouraged here today that it's very much past tense as well. We have, and God has been preparing us. Where are we? Where have we been? How has God been preparing us? And are we self-aware? In our next episode, we're going to continue with this topic of preparing for missions, because there's a lot left unsaid, and we look forward to that conversation, and we hope you can all be along. Thanks for being with us.